So, Alexander and Kurt, thank you very much for joining today for this interview. And so, Alexander, if I may start with you, what does collective thrivability mean to you?
Collective thrivability for me is indeed almost the only type of life-affirming and future-creating and opportunity-increasing pathway that exists. It almost doesn't make sense to talk about individual thrivability as if we could thrive by ourselves. There really is only collective thrivability. And for me, this is an aspect of being and becoming that draws us together because it recognizes this fundamental interdependence of all life. And it moves beyond the frameworks of sustainability. Not to say that sustainability is either incorrect or the sustainability is unnecessary. I think it's incredibly important, and frankly, it is the next step that we should be engaging with. But it's not the last step, and we should be making sure, I think, that we're also looking further down the road. So with regard to sustainability, to live within the carrying capacity of our environment, whether it's our local environment or a planetary environment, living within the carrying capacity is very important. And that's basically what sustainability requests of us. But it does not ask of us to do so with joy, or to live in this way with an effort or an eye to how we can create abundance. Because it's just living within the carrying capacity, right? And it doesn't suggest and cultivate creativity beyond being able to address those parameters of viability. So joy, awe, a sense of the sacred, a celebration of life, none of that is promoted by sustainability. And thrivability, when we do it with life, with others, that means, and I'm sure I'll get onto this later on in the conversation, but it means doing so at several different levels of engagement. Each one needs to be sustainable, but when taken all together and when done in an interactive engagement, then you can move towards thrivability. By the way, another term for thrivability is flourishing. There are several people, David Cooperwriter, John Earhart, and my brother Chris Laszlo prefer to use the term flourishing. And they talk about flourishing enterprise and flourishing societies. And the two, I think, are just very similar terms. I think that perhaps we can talk about systems that thrive within thriving environments, and that the thriving environment elicits and creates the conditions. The flourishing environment creates the conditions for the thriving of the individual flowers and plants, and think about the ecosystem or us, right? And that by thriving together, we create a flourishing environment. So there's this back and forth between the two. And I like to think about those two different uses of the term thriving and flourishing in that relation. But many people use the terms interchangeably. And they think of perhaps thrivability or flourishing as a kind of sustainability 2.0, or systemic sustainability, or integral sustainability, or integral prosperity. Sometimes people talk about it, since it's not just the economic or financial prosperity that often one thinks about, but truly whole life richness and engagement. That's what it means to me.
Wonderful, thank you. And Kurt, what does it mean to you?
Collective drivability is like an invisible thread, which is the expression of the very archetype of being. Being expresses itself in the collective drivability. However, sometimes you might focus on a specific small collectivity within the total collectivity. And you may have the feeling that these sub-collectivities are in fact trying to eat each other, as very often life thrives by taking over another life. So you may, when you look at it, have the feeling that some aspects are contradictory. However, you need to remind yourself that all of it is a complete being and they are only parts of it. In the same manner that in our body, we will have different functions that all of them are contributing to the final existence and the well-being of the body.
Interesting. Thank you. Good, let me stay with you first and then I go back to Alexander. So in terms of your work, could you explain then how your work supports that kind of transformational change for our collective thrivability?
In my work, I have, first of all, what I am is a psychosocial expert working in psychotherapy, coaching. This sounds very contradictory to having a holistic approach because I'm seeing individuals and I have to make these individuals find their personal right balance, which might seem contradictory again to the collective balance. However, within the process whereby they start to ask themselves what they want, where they want to go, who they are, I have included a question whereby I make them ask themselves, what is it that you like and dislike in your environment? That means in the weather around you, in the life around you, and not only human life, but also the more primitive life, including the vegetable life and all the life that you don't see. So this pushes them further into understanding and having, for the first time for many of them, a consciousness of the existence of a collective tribability.
Wonderful, that's great. And Alexander, how does that question relate to you? So in terms of your work, how does that support transformational change for our collective thrivability?
Well, my work is very much focused on the let's say the next and contiguous part of the spectrum from what Kurt was just talking about. It's I'm looking at the evolutionary learning community, right? The community that learns how to learn in harmony with the dynamics of its broader environment. And this is based on an area of praxis that I have worked to develop called evolutionary systems design. And here, trying to create the conditions of self-empowerment at the community level, very similar to what Kurt was talking about at the individual level, the same type of questions, but this now brings it into a stage of exploring the potential of the collective, the potential of the dreaming potential, the dream space of what, not just what they could be as a community, but what the world could be in which they could live. So they are, and then to use all kind of approaches, including backcasting, where they were going from the dream into the present, but always thinking about these evolution learning communities as places and spaces where individuals can come together to learn about the sacred relationships that they have with each other and with nature, and with themselves, and with past and future generations, and doing so in an atmosphere and a spirit of joy and creativity, and not just survival, but also saying what is it that brings us alive. So very similar in those kind of sourcing questions to what Kurt was saying, but now with a collective dream frame.
Wonderful. So I'd like to deepen that, because it brings us to the next question. Part of the research is to get a better understanding also of the systemic barriers that we encounter in this work. Where are you looking at? Many people have this aspirationally, and they hold it as a vision, and that's what they really want. And then in the living context of that, they encounter all kinds of barriers within themselves, within the organizations that they're working in, also at the collective level. So what we like to do to the research is to be able to articulate and name some of those barriers also better, so we can better understand what it is about. So could you shine some light on that, on this kind of systemic barriers that you encountered in this work?
Well, I think they really come into two big categories. One, those that when you under-conceptualize the potential, and you don't dream big enough. So we can't do that. We can't be like this. We just have to focus on just surviving and of course there are many situations in which there are immediate concerns of living hand to mouth. But there are many who have written about how hope and joy live as fundamental life-giving impulses, even in the hardest of times and of moments. And to be able to tap into those and to move forward with that, where people will say, well, we only have to focus on the pain, and on minimizing the pain, then there is never the chance to actually dream beyond it. And the struggle to engage with the pain remains almost the identity of being. So one aspect is under conceptualizing, and the other aspect would be to overstructure or overcondition the change possibilities, the possibility space. That has to include all of these different expectations. It has to include all of so not allowing things to emerge, but putting a preconception of what it should be like in a way that doesn't play with the emergence. So there's the two different sides to almost the same thing. Under conceptualizing it, not enough belief in the possibility, and over constraining it to be able to say that there is it ought to be this and that and the other thing. Then it can never even take off the ground because it's way too heavy to fly. And I think that therefore I would say that the main barriers are ones that we impose upon ourselves consistently, just saying that we can't do that. And can't meaning either it's not legally right, people wouldn't think that that's correct, or it's impossible. It's impossible to do that. So all of this impossible business makes it very much like a barrier, a very strict barrier. Those who come with what I would call proximal, like the aspects of almost one's limbs that are closed in, right? Not distal. So those aspects that are the extended portions of ourselves. So the distal life passions, those things that connect us to life and that we engage in because we would like to make the world a better place and live in that world. People who engage in those tend to engage in thrivability practices and projects. People who engage in the proximal life interests, which is what can I get out of this for myself? What is it going to make me? How is it going to make me richer, more powerful, have a higher status, something like that? Then there is no room for the thrivability. Last thing I think that combines all of this is how you make a fire. If you stack the logs too tightly, there's no room for the air to flow. And if there's no room for the air to flow, nothing will catch, and there will be no fire in your fireplace. So not holding it too tightly, dancing the path, playing with it, I think is key. And when it's overstructured and overconstrained, underconceptualized, and held in a very proximal way, then those are the biggest barriers, I feel, to this type of engagement.
Thank you. And Kurt, for you?
As you may know, I have chosen to work in the environment, human environment, and also geographical environment in which I work. Meaning that I encounter as many systemic barriers as humanly possible in the same day. I start with somebody who's a Buddhist. I might end up with an atheist, having been through Islamic system, Christian system, and many other peculiar systems. And each one of them has his own restrictions that have been imposed on the individual by an organization. And I still need to be able to make the individuals find their blossoming path within these difficulties. And you also have intersystemic barriers in what I deal with. Like you would have a Christian commenting on the marital behavior of a Muslim and adamantly thinking that he's right and the other one is wrong. And just after him, I would have a Muslim coming saying, she's my second wife, and everybody agrees about that. And the lady with a great smile, yes, we're coming for the case of my cousin, and so on. So I move in the same day from different systemic barriers and also the intersystemic barriers, because each one of them believe that they are right and the other one is wrong. And I have to find a seat within all these systemic barriers to help them grow, and at the same time integrate in the collective level, because otherwise life would be unbearable for all of them who believe that they have the only truth. And when they get to have this homogeneous national conception of being one nation, they suddenly discover that the rest of the world exists and that the rest of the world has got a lot of restriction for them.
So Earth is north, air as east, fire as south, and water as west. and that none of these can be owned, none of these can be taken, none of these can be lived with except for in sacred relationship. And they all must be, this relationship among the four lives within us, because the air, the earth is our body, the air is our breath, the fire is our energy, and the water is our blood. And all of these in us and in the planet and in the cosmos dance. And when all are in good or in right relationship, then the fifth element or the fifth sacred thing emerges. And that's spirit. And that is that engagement. It emerges, it's always there, right? Because these elements are always in relationship with each other. They emerge from spirit indeed. And yet we come into that connection with spirit when we are in what many talk about as right relationship, or at least in this sacred relationship among these different frames. So again, seeing this other narrative, seeing when we're so caught up in the material world and so caught up in the proximal rather than the distal, the proximal aspects of our relationships and our power games and all the money things, all the human myopias, then this bigger conditioning slips away. And yet this is the conditioning, or this is the framing that leads us to fundamental thrivability.
Alexander, I'll start with you. So what would you say are the most important factors and conditions that need to be present for humanity to avoid this kind of irreversible collapse of our life support systems and the breakdown also of our social, cultural, and ecological fabrics?
Factors and conditions.
Yes.
Well, let me preface this by saying that there are these 5 dimensions of thrivability, and they're detailed in one of the. Well, you know them very well, of course, but they're also in one of the documents that I sent you prior to this, or in relation to this conversation, and. The idea is that, in a way, we can think about sustainability. Do you remember I mentioned in the earlier part of this conversation that we had the 4 sacred things, and the 5th sacred thing being spirit that emerges from this, coming from the work of Starhawk. And in a way, these 4 dimensions of thrivability, you can think of it at each level as being one aspect of sustainability. But then when all the aspects of sustainability are present, what emerges is thrivability. So thrivability is the integral attendance to and curating of the quality of relationship at all these 5 different levels. In fact, there are 5 levels. So the first level is the intrapersonal, and the second level, and I'm not going to go in more detail because you know these,
yes.
Right? Just for the sake of the audience. There's the interpersonal. Then the second level is the interpersonal level of sustainability, and the third level is the trans-species level of sustainability. The 4th level would be the transgenerational, which takes the 3 previous levels and puts it diachronically over time. The transgenerational relationship, both ancestors and future generations having that thriving conversation, or the conversation about thrivability, and the 5th level is the pan-cosmic, which again is not something that is talked about that I talk about with all audiences. Mainly, it's the first 4 levels are even those are stretched sometimes, but the last level, there has to be a level of trust. There has to be a level of humility. There has to be a fundamental alignment with the quality and value of love, and there has to be a sense of being part of something much bigger. So these, I would say, are some of the factors and conditions. My friend and colleague Matthew Shapiro, who you know from some of the exchanges on Facebook, recently quoted Mary Parker Foley, I think beautifully so, when she was saying that the problem is when people perceive me as a part of the whole, and that I am a very specific part with my own expression, whereas that is not the truth. The truth is I am the whole, as seen from a particular perspective or a particular part. But I am the whole. I love that. Mm-hmm. So once we can see ourselves in that frame, then I think the conditions for humanity to transcend are in place. But it requires those other things that I mentioned. It requires that levels of trust along all those 5 dimensions. Trust in oneself, and trust in each other, and trust in nature. In that we're not living in a world is out to get us all the time. Not in a paranoid form relationship with nature, but a really one that is a supportive engagement. And trust in past and future generations as well. We're not at war with each other or with other cultures or with other times. So trust, the sense of inclusive being, that this is who I am, this larger frame, a sense of the sacred, a sense of awe, a sense of not only a sense, but a conviction, is better than sense, that love is fundamental to all healthy relations. Mm-hmm. And that we are in this, being willing to have this conversation, being willing to have this dance, and being willing to play. I think the last thing I'll say on this aspect is we talk about the difference between those who, of course, those who simply and merely talk the talk. You know, they talk about whatever it is, thrivability, let's say, and those who walk the talk, where they really are clearly, able to not just know the theory around it, but they are an expression of what it is they're talking about. They walk their talk. And yet that's different from those who live their path, because the people, who live their talk, or those people who really are 100% coherent. It's their way of life. It's they're not doing this to try to give you a presentation. It's just their way of life. Mm-hmm. And that is still different from the people who dance their path, because the people who live their walk, it's the right expression, who live the walk, can often do it like they are priests in a seminary, and they have a holier than thou attitude, that I am more thrivable than you. My life is, I actually know more about thrivability. I've studied it, and not only that, but I've set up my own community, and I'm more thrivable than you. So I'm that kind of holding it so rigidly, and so, yes, maybe almost piously, but more without the play, without the bit of irreverence, without the ability to question all the sacred cows, and to play through them. Then you dance your path. And dancing the path, I think, is key also to this type of transcendence. If we hold it too tightly on what there is, or what there should be, or what there must be, we're going to not allow it to have its own breath and its own expression. And fundamentally, what's emerging now is bigger than any of us. And yet it is all of us. And we have to allow it to grow and emerge. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. I just want to deepen this on two aspects. And it's beautiful. One of them is that the case studies in the research concern people who would say we love that and absolutely agree, yet are unable to live that in an environment in which we have to either learn, this were the schools, or work, which were the businesses. And were expressed that they felt very much trapped in systems that they know are destroying these vital life support systems, as well as our social, cultural, ecological fabrics. So our interconnectedness, or what you referred to earlier as right way of relating, right relationships. So they're very aware that the environment in which they're either learning, studying for the students, or working those in business are damaging. And they would so much love to breathe into, live, walk the path, be the path, dance the path that you just shared, but feel unable to do that within the systems that determine so much of the activities, yes? And so if we want to be able to translate these messages to a way that they can also act upon in their systems, then if we then look at the factors and conditions that would need to be present for them to be able both support the transformation within those systems as well as to thrive, how can we deepen that a little bit?
Again, I think it's fine to seek to cultivate the communities of engagement that where there is, or where there is a receptivity for trust, awe, sacredness, love. And I don't put love last because it's least important, but because it's most.
Yeah.
And a sense of play. But those, there may not be those in all the environments where they work, or where they live, or where they find themselves. And yet, these are key elements to moving forward. And they do exist. We find each other across the distances now. They're not all together necessarily because of a geographic form of community. There's a community of place, which is geographic. There's a community of interest, and there is a community of practice. These are the three main types of communities. And so they often have overlap, but community of place might not be where we have most of the interaction, although it may be in our family or in our local living community where we dwell. But it may be through a community of interest. We're working all on questions of new educational paradigm. Or it may be in a community of practice, where we have people who are all social systems designers. But some way, finding those communities, and then in those, finding those subgroups of the communities that have those 5 characteristics that I was mentioning. And I think the metaphor for me here, to give hope, it comes from a colleague of mine, Gail Taylor, who talks about escaping to the next level. She talks about the way in which if there are bubbles of air way down in the ocean, let's say released by a whale who's swimming way down, and there are shelves or maybe ice, the air will always go up, and then it will find its way to the next place where it can go up more. And sometimes it's trapped, but it will always move because it'll sense currents. And as the currents move in certain ways, they displace the air and will find its way to the surface somehow. And I think when we are trapped like that, like bubbles of air someplace, is to find those currents, find those conversations, those dynamics, those communities that can help us escape to the next level of engagement. But the metaphor of the bubbles of air moving upwards always through the water think is useful to think of it when we are ourselves trapped. The idea is not to stay trapped. And because then the conditions may not occur. And the idea is to try to work in those areas where trapped and convert them into those loving types of communities may not be worth the effort. In other words, you may end up with a very high opportunity cost, this is called, or a very high price to pay for trying to do that. Whereas if you were to move to a community that had greater receptivity for this, again, not necessarily geographically move, but shift your attentions to one or the other types of communities, you may have a greater opportunity to escape to the next level.
Thank you for clarifying that. That's great. Kurt, for you, the same question.
What would you say are the most important factors and conditions that need to be present for humanity to avoid irreversible collapse of our life support system and the breakdown of our social culture and ecological fabrics? There's something in your question which is very puzzling. You're assuming that humanity is one, that the social culture is one, and they're definitely not. If you look at the place on which we're having our life, we could go to the extreme of saying that you have people that are very conscious, to the other extremes that you have, as some would say, bipeds. So all over the planet, there's something essential missing, which is planetary consciousness. There's no such a thing as planetary consciousness all over the planet. Some people have achieved it, but the majority are still trying to do their own little thing, their own cooking. They have their own socio-cultural way of being, and each one of them is pulling in a different direction. Before we can claim to be able to do anything, we need to have planetary consciousness. Of course, we can take it further and consider that the planet is within the cosmos. But first level, planetary consciousness. And that is something toward which we have to work. Now, for the planetary consciousness, how do we get there? What are the elements that can help us get there? And in the word humanity, you have a little play that you could play with the words. You could change a few words, a few letters in humanity, and go for humility. They are so close. And the way to humanity is certainly which allowed us to learn from each other. And this is very simple and basic things like daily living. And this is where a place like where I live and work is fantastic to learn, because we have different socio-cultural way of being colliding with each other every day and also enriching each other every day just by doing things differently. A very down-to-earth example that might not please, but so it is as you say in French, very often the French say, tu pues du cul. And when you look at the way the French goes to the toilet and how his hygiene goes, he doesn't wash himself after having been there. But the Indian, after going there, he uses a small shower, which is much more hygienic. And you would see that the different social cultural system exist on the same island, where people look at each other as if they don't know what the other can contribute to their well-being, to the progress of their being. And yet, in these small little things, if you start to be humble and to accept that the other might have something to share with you, to teach you, then you can grow together. You become stronger. Then you can evolve into a higher consciousness of humanity, and so forth until you reach the planetary consciousness, whereby the difference of socio-cultural approaches gradually is starting to become one humanity socio-cultural system, with variations, of course, which would always exist, because we cannot claim that we're all going to be put in a mold and become all the same. We will have our differences. And from that, you can start to have a look at the ecological fabric, how to protect it. Because you should not forget that while some socio-cultural systems are thriving, materialistically speaking, others are just discovering what a fridge is. So where is the planetary consciousness there? You have these concepts about well-being that needs to evolve, and they cannot evolve until we accept that we have to learn from each other and to share with each other as well. Because if we don't share the wealth that we have with those that have less, you cannot have a planetary consciousness, and therefore this progress that we're looking for cannot happen without sharing, without humility.
Thank you very much. And what's interesting in both your replies is that when you name both the factors as well as the conditions, they have to do with our attitude and with our approach. And also with what we value and how we appreciate. So they're kind of coming from within our own humanity. So to deepen this once more, I would like to ask you them both to comment on the following. So if you're talking about these factors and conditions, some of those factors and conditions currently present with regards to the kind of ecosystemic collapse points that we've reached. Yeah? Are there also, would these attitudes and approaches that you're mentioning come under constraint if our environmental factors become worse? So in order, for example, in situations of scarcity or climate change runaway scenarios or extreme weather events, what would be the impact of that on the kind of factors and conditions you both indicated that are very much within our own reach and our own humanity?
Yeah, and the question is directed to whom at this point?
Both of you, whoever wants to comment first.
Kurt?
I'll let you.
I passed it to you. You're passing it back. All right. Well, Kurt was just talking about several things that we had also mentioned earlier. I mean, fundamentally, he's pointing to the evolution of consciousness as being the core component of this. That humanity, at this point, doesn't have a uniform stage of consciousness. And that there are those who are experimenting with and experiencing a different, what some people talk about as an integral consciousness, other ones talk about a cosmic consciousness. Barbara Marx Hubbard writes about the Homo Universalis. So there are different frames. Talk about the imaginal selves. She likes using that frame. Who are in the process of, as there's breakdown, there's breakthrough. There are those who are in the who are staying in the breakdown and who are trying to fix the breakdown, and who are everything about the issue is what's wrong. And in that framework, they are not allowing to let go and to emerge into into the potential of the new levels of consciousness. And there are those who are experimenting with this, who are working with it. But again, there are, even within those who are working with a different form of consciousness that's, let's say, more integral, what Claire Graves or Don Beck in Spiral Dynamics would talk about, the second tier of yellow and turquoise and beyond levels of consciousness. Even there are those who, again, will approach it in a very rigid way, and who are not willing to play with it. But I think we were talking about the same things, and a lot of this comes to something also that Kurt was mentioning that I just wrote down here: to live simply, so that others may simply live. Yes. You know, and we don't often have that frame, but that's both a self-holding and not over complicating the situations. It's really this idea of getting into the heart of things.
Yeah, that's where we go next. Yeah.
And yes, I'm holding off. But yeah, I think that at this juncture, when our challenge as a species, and it's quite true that I don't want to say our common humanity, because we have very little in common across our different cultural frames, but there's so much that we have in common as well, of course. And yet, in terms of readiness to transcend, there's tremendous amounts of different levels here, and that's fine. It's as it should be. Indeed, all evolutionary systems at point before an evolutionary transformation, before there is a quantum leap or a stochastic shift, there is a great degree of variety and experimentation of different possibilities. And it's always at the periphery of the viable systems that you find the often the strangest even ways of exploring new patterns of being and becoming. And those then, without being able to determine ahead of time which are the patterns that are going to take hold or that are going to become the attractors, they do. And they flow. And I think at this time, without being able to predetermine it, we can already sense into it. The greatest technology we have is the human technology of through the heart, that involves both intuitive and affective knowing. And it is a form of knowing. It's not the conceptual knowing. It's much more of a Gestalt type knowing. But even there, we're putting words on things that it's a sensing of being. But it combines both sensing and feeling and the different forms of whole system somatic engagement. And I think when we allow ourselves this, and we are in those safe places and the type of communities that we talked about earlier, that have the awe, the sacredness, the love, the trust, the joy, and the willingness to play, then we are giving the conditions that are ripe for the birthing of new forms of being. And those new forms of being are ourselves. And we can surprise ourselves when we're saying, this is so weird, but it feels right. Those kind of things, I think, are hallmarks of new evolutionary frames of consciousness. So providing the allowance for that, being able to dream into that, and also being able to see that as not just the abstract dreams, but the play spaces even when there is the challenge of survival, as you say, even when there things break down, even when there are, let's say things get worse before they get better, right? Let's say it gets very dark before the dawn. I think in those frames, will we revert to more hostile, more rudimentary, more survival, self-interest frames? I'm sure many will. Many will. And yet, this is part of that birthing challenge, and it comes in great kind of fractal harmony with many of the teachings from wisdom traditions, where when there is a death and a transition, there's the path of the Bardo. And the Bardo path is a path of great temptation to be led aside and to repeat cycles rather than to flow all the way through the path without moving into side, mainly illusions, the dimensions of ego. But when we can face even challenge and adversity and remember our story, our narrative of love and connection, then I think there will be those who will pass through this time. But those who will only be looking for trying to maximize their survival now won't. And that's part of that whole natural process. It's okay. Not everyone is going to move through this transition.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Is there anything, Gert, you want to add to that?
And it's like an in-between question between the 5 and the 6.
Yeah.
So you want us to say what you're feeling?
Not really.
I'm just teasing.
Yeah, fundamentally, it's more also a question: will we actually be able to avoid irreversible collapse? Because we are now also looking for those conditions and factors within our own consciousness, human consciousness. At the same time, Kurt, you mentioned planetary consciousness is an incredibly important condition. So,
if I may.
Yes.
You have whether we succeed or not, the treatment is probably the same. And we have not much choice. If you look around the planet, you would see that the places where the average person has a better quality of life, well-being, instead of being isolated in a society which has gone bankrupt, like the majority of the Western European societies, where you have individuals all alone dying or being put in isolation. You have some concepts that are different that you might find around the world, but most especially in the Nordic country, where people have been coming together as groups and thinking as groups, as think tanks, having retreats as such. And these groups, irrespective of their political, religious, or whatever ideological beliefs, they have come to a group, small group consciousness of what they want their world to be. It's clearer in their mind, and therefore they are more engaged into it. And these countries have done better for the individuals. You have some places where they have the same sort of concepts, and which just, unfortunately, they haven't had the same organization in the society, because they were also divided in groups, which is dangerous. I'm thinking now more of the Indian subcontinent. But they both have in common this concept of group that needs to be protected and that would protect the individual. And you see a very clear experimentation of that in the Silicon Valley, where each time you've had companies that were on the verge of bankruptcy, if the people, the majority of workers were Indians, not red Indians, they accepted to take down their pay as a concept of solidarity towards the other workers. And they managed to keep everybody working, and they went for the thick. And finally, when it was over, they were more thriving than the other companies because they had developed a group consciousness. So this concept of group consciousness is a make or break necessity for the so-called humanity in becoming. And if we want to save the planet, we need to have this attitude and this way of being, of course, with the various socio-cultural variations. And we need to start to get going more on that, instead of just simply thinking, okay, he's the first in his group, fantastic. We've had a culture of we need to have champions absolutely, even if it means killing a lot of people to get one champion. While it's the opposite. The champion should be there to stop all the people being killed. And these concepts need to be given a fair share of exposure. And that's why I've been coming back on it in your question.
Thank you. That's very useful from both of you. So that moves us then into the sixth question. What does going into the heart of systems change mean to you? So Alexander, for you first.
Well, before and this is somewhat of a dialogue because you're doing this interview with both Kurt and with me at the same time, and so there are many things which I would love to pick up on. I've written down here. I'm going to have to send them to Kurt afterwards, and I might copy you.
Thank you.
Anneloes. I will, of course.
Well, you can go into that now a little bit as well if you feel it's useful to mention.
Well, just one thing. I'm going to send something later on as a separate piece. It's a little work for an excerpt from science fiction that I think might really interest you, Kurt. But I'll send that later on. The Art of Plexity.
You've sent that to us already.
Did you already see that? Then, the Art of Plexity,
yes.
Right? Because it really seemed like. Kurt, you were talking about that to a large extent earlier on in the first part of the interview, where people have, a simplex worldviews, and they can't imagine how anybody else could see the world differently than they see it. I mean, they know that people see it differently, but they feel the poor devils. If only they could see things the way I do, they would be enlightened or they'd be saved. If they could see it. And then, of course, people move to the complex level where they would say, I know there are several different views. I like this one most, but I can try another one, and I'm going to shift to another one, and then I just try another one. But it's all sequential, and then they move to from simplex to complex to multiplex, the multiplex view, where they are able to hold two different worldviews at the same time, and see even the contradictions. To say, I know that this, like you were saying, the Muslim and the Christian about views about relationships, for example, about what it means, fidelity, and so on. And they would have very different views, but you could say, I know both are true. Both are the truth. That's okay. Even though they're contradictory. How can you hold that? And then, of course, there's the ideal of the omniplex, to be able to hold all views. But anyway, I thought that fits directly. And I also liked the idea that it made me think of the fact that this transition that we go through, if there's a breakdown and it becomes a catastrophic breakdown or apocalyptic, there's still going to be. I really think that the likelihood of there being a total annihilation of either all life or even just human life on the planet is very low, possible. But even if there is or isn't, I would almost say it's irrelevant because our attitude of engagement has to be that there is a future. It's this business that Federico Mayor Zaragoza, who used to be the director of UNESCO for many years, and is a very prestigious thought leader in the world. In an interview I did with him recently, he said, people say if you want peace, you have to prepare for war. And he said, it's the stupidest possible thing anyone could say. Did we talk about this earlier as well?
No, but you sent a video.
Yes, there was a video with him.
We've listened to
video
that.
from that.
Yes.
But I mean, isn't it true? I mean, and then again, if we are thinking in an analogous way, if we're thinking, okay, we want to transcend, we want to come into a different evolution of consciousness, a different way of expressing what it means to be human as part of a different, larger narrative of life on this planet as part of the cosmos, then if we're thinking about what's going to happen if we're going to have an apocalypse, all we're doing is inviting those frames and readying ourselves for that. Whatever happens, we will be ready in some way, because that's the nature of evolutionary transcendence. Well, everything that has brought us to this point in our evolutionary path has prepared us for the challenges that are coming. It's just the way it is. The other saying, it's one thing to let the birds of worry fly overhead. And it's quite another thing to let them build a nest in your beard or in your hair, And it's true, that's the part of it. How do we know and acknowledge that there are these challenges, but not have them drive us as the obsession points? And finally, just before I move to actually the question you asked, Anneloes, are you guys familiar with this? I put it into our chat there. The Kardashev scale. It's a idea that different civilizations in the universe go through different levels of civilizational advance, and that we on this planet haven't even reached the first level. And that we are now at the challenge point of possibly reaching the first level. The theory being that possibly no civilizations in the universe, no species in the universe has ever passed the first level, because the challenge to do so is too high. You have to be able to live with such advanced technology that if you don't have the moral and ethical, or the commensurate moral and ethical development, that the species self-destroys. This is part of that framing. And while I agree that this is a real challenge point that we're at right now as a species, a global species at this point, I think that there will be, not only think that there will be, but there has to be. It doesn't make sense to think about it in any other way. A path forward. I don't know if it's for all humanity or how much, and even if it's for those who are best positioned or not best positioned. There's certainly going to be a lot of variables involved, and a lot of factors that are not simply choosing the most optimized groups. All kind of things will play into it. But it comes to the little challenge I used to give to my master's students in research methodology, which was the final exam, which was simply this: if you are in a desert and all you see around you is dunes of sand, you just see one dune after the other, and that's all you see. You don't see anything else. And suddenly, over one of the dunes comes running straight towards you a man-eating tiger. You know that the only way to escape a man-eating tiger is to climb a palm tree. But there are no palm trees in sight. What do you do? So that's the question that my students have. And they're very frustrated. And but the answer is given. The answer is given. It's right there. It says the only way to escape this tiger is to climb a palm tree. So all other answers are irrelevant. They will talk about, well, you could try to trick the tiger, and then you could try to turn it. I have some very creative solutions, but it doesn't matter. Because there are no palm trees in sight. You better find a palm tree. You better find one and climb it. Because that's your own, anything else doesn't matter. It's over. So for us, the same thing, I think, as humanity. Yes, there could be apocalypse. Yes, everything could be destroyed. Yes, nobody could make it. It doesn't matter. Either we're going to be banking on and moving towards all those pathways that bring us into thrivability, or it doesn't matter. This is the only path forward. So for me, it's as Noam Chomsky once says, optimism is a strategy for the future. And so this is the strategy. This is the frame to engage. All right, done with. I'm actually going to answer your question that you asked. Question number 6. I wasn't done with question 5.
So what does going into the heart of systems change mean to you?
Well, for me, it means sourcing. It means what it means to be a sorcerer. And again, that's going into the source, going through one's own heart into connection with all, with each other, with ourselves, all those 5 dimensions that I mentioned. Of course, there are many more, but those are a nice way of structuring it for me, at least. And, right, the self, the other, nature, past and future generations, and the cosmos. And it's this heart of systems change is the source of the cosmic creation, the source of cosmic emergence, the source of not just life, because life is a particular manifestation of that source on this planet. But the cosmos is all the time exploring patterns of being and becoming. And we are one of those patterns. And connecting with that bigger narrative of being and becoming, and recognizing how we're one of those expressions, and then enjoying that gift of being one of those expressions, but knowing that it is interconnected, interdependent, because of its fundamental interrelationship. That makes it truly systemic. So it's, for me, this going into the heart of systems change means a shifting of consciousness and understanding not that I am only just the flesh-bound me, but that I am part of this planet seeking to express itself. That I am, like Mary Parker Follett says, this whole system from a particular lens. This is, for me, the Alexander lens of the whole system, right? But it's not that I am Alexander looking at the whole, so somehow separate from the whole system. We're all different expressions of that system. And going into the heart of systems change is both appreciating that the multiplexity of those of that perspective, and also developing what I like to call a Synteny sense, but it's this sense of interdependence, interconnection, interrelationship. And fundamentally, just to round that off, the Synteny sense means listening into our own emergence in dynamic harmony with everything. It's connecting to everything, not disconnecting, but looking for connections and seeing connections even when they're hidden. It's not only looking for those things that we can resonate with, that really bring us alive, or that seem to be vibrationally attuned with ourselves, but because that's just resonance. But consonance is about trying to create those dynamics, trying to align our different frequencies with each other and with all of life. And then there's the aspect of coherence. So connection, connection, consonance, and coherence. And coherence means that we are dancing together in a way that has direction, dimension, and meaning, that has substance, not substance, physical substance, but that fills us, that with awe, with joy, with a sense of the sacred, going through that heart of connection is the litmus to know that this is a path of heart, a path that brings us, or that brings us toward the future that is calling. In other words, that is aligned or in synteny again with this greater process of being and becoming that expresses itself as life on this planet and as creativity throughout the cosmos.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. And Kurt, going into the heart of systems change. What does it mean to you?
I have built my practice in a manner that I'm forced to do it. And I have no choice. If I want to help, be useful, to feel that I'm alive, but to surrender regularly into the archetype of archetypes, so that either I am given or it facilitates around me the change for a betterment. That's all.
It's beautiful. Thank you. And that brings me then to the final question for this exploration. And I'll start with you, Alexander. So what is your key message to humanity now? And also to the future generations from the perspective that you are their ancestor?
To listen to your heart, to listen to the bigger heart that is the heart of life, that is the heart of the heart, if you can. And I don't mean the heart of the heart. Often we think of that as like going into something smaller, at the very heart of things we talk about. You know, we're going to the very heart of the issue. Sometimes it seems that you're going into something small. No. It's quite the opposite. This heart is always bigger. It's the heart of the cosmos. And there is a pulse of being and becoming. If I say a pulse of life, I feel I'm limiting ourselves to this planet Earth being the whole universe, and it's not. It's actually a very small part. I mean, a very small part of the huge creative cosmos. But we are not distinct from, we're not an anomaly, we're not something, an aberration. Indeed, we are the universe in its true flourishing expression. And feeling into what that flourishing is, what that sense of thriving, becoming, listening to your heart as it beats all around you, in the eyes of others. Sometimes it beats too fast. Sometimes it almost stops. But all of that is life. All of that is an expression of the cosmos in some way. And celebrating that expression and having empathy and care for that heartbeat, and trying to foster an invitation, foster those expressions of the heart that make it dance with joy. Not hedonistically, not for the sake of just having the experience of joy, but for being a true expression of the universe, of the cosmos. And listening and trusting that you know that your body, your being, your greater self knows how to dance. Even if you don't know exactly what the next steps are, letting go and allowing that next step to happen. And if you fall, to laugh and try again. Again, I think this is part of that air escaping to the next level, and that we can do now more consciously than a bubble of air does as it moves up. We can try to see the patterns of what connects and what brings forth and strengthens a strong, vibrant heartbeat. That's I think, the message of listening into our being and becoming.
Beautiful. Thank you. And Kurt, for you, your message to humanity now and the future generations, and the perspective that you are the ancestor.
This is what it is all about. In a way, this is one aspect. This is just a conversation. But this is just a conversation? I don't know. I move away from this conversation changed. Changed, enriched, and loved, enveloped. And this is the dance. These are the conversations that bring forth the realities that we wish to live into. And this is what it means to me also, collective thrivability. We're doing this together. In other words, from a very Zen perspective, we can talk about this all that you want, and we can write about it, we can have dissertations on it. This is it. You can't really name this. What we have done is, and what we are doing, it's not a have done. It's a beingness. And this is about being the systems we want to see in the world. And I want to be in these conversations, in this dance. I would love to be able to do so in a way that combines those three kinds of communities of place and of interest and of practice, so that we can wake up every day and engage in not just these conversations, but also in the practice, right? The community of practice that relates to these, the community of interest that explores them, and the chance to wake up together, that we are, able to explore these in an ongoing way, not just sporadically, and then I get the phone call and I have to go to the next meeting, etc. Right? So this is where I escape, and then I go into other domains that are not at these levels. And it could be frustrating. It could be a sense of, that's not, just depends on where I want to hold, which is my higher reality. And the other things I'm involved in on a mundane day-to-day basis are not the higher reality. And I think this is the time that we are transcending. So I hold them as the norm of engagement in this day and age, but it doesn't define me or us. And so this is this all of this the smiles, here's the joy, here's the beingness. And again, this is just one small aspect because it's just a conversation. But when we go exploring and walking together, and when we look at the sky and we see the birds, and then when we cook together, and all of these things are expressions of that, expressions of the heart of systems change.
Yes. That's wonderful. Very nice. Thank you both.
Well, thank you for doing this and for pulling this all together. My goodness, you realize that what a flow attractor you're being, Anneloes. You're making channels.
Thank you.
And then all of this flows.
See. The ancestor is in the future, of which I'm just a part. So, since I am also the ancestor of the past, I turn my eyes to Nicolas de Cuse with his incomparable work, D'Ignorance. You strive to know all your life, but know that you will never know everything. And knowing that, enjoy.
Thank you. Very wonderful. And in closing, is there anything that either of you would like to add that you feel you haven't had a chance to express yet here?
This is what it is all about. In a way, this is one aspect. This is just a conversation. But this is just a conversation? I don't know. I move away from this conversation changed. Changed, enriched, and loved, enveloped. And this is the dance. These are the conversations that bring forth the realities that we wish to live into. And this is what it means to me also, collective thrivability. We're doing this together. In other words, from a very Zen perspective, we can talk about this all that you want, and we can write about it, we can have dissertations on it. This is it. You can't really name this. What we have done is, and what we are doing, it's not a have done. It's a beingness. And this is about being the systems we want to see in the world. And I want to be in these conversations, in this dance. I would love to be able to do so in a way that combines those three kinds of communities of place and of interest and of practice, so that we can wake up every day and engage in not just these conversations, but also in the practice, right? The community of practice that relates to these, the community of interest that explores them, and the chance to wake up together, that we are, able to explore these in an ongoing way, not just sporadically, and then I get the phone call and I have to go to the next meeting, etc. Right? So this is where I escape, and then I go into other domains that are not at these levels. And it could be frustrating. It could be a sense of, that's not, just depends on where I want to hold, which is my higher reality. And the other things I'm involved in on a mundane day-to-day basis are not the higher reality. And I think this is the time that we are transcending. So I hold them as the norm of engagement in this day and age, but it doesn't define me or us. And so this is this, all of this, the smiles, here's the joy, here's the beingness. And again, this is just one small aspect because it's just a conversation. But when we go exploring and walking together, and when we look at the sky and we see the birds, and then when we cook together, and all of these things are expressions of that, expressions of the heart of systems change.
Yes. That's wonderful. Very nice. Thank you both.
Well, thank you for doing this and for pulling this all together. My goodness, you realize that what a flow attractor you're being, Anneloes. You're making channels.
Thank you.
And then all of this flows.